one of the transformations that took place between the Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Shniyos, the suggestion that in fact the font of the Luchos was different when it came to certain letters. Today I want to discuss other transformations which are definitely more clear in Chazal and understand the differences between the Luchos Rishonos and the Luchos Shniyos, but not in terms of the content. We know that there are many differences, whether it be Zachar, V'Shamar, or other differences between the Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Shniyos, but not the content per se, but in fact how the Torah changed, the difference which perhaps we are still suffering from today, if you will. We know that the Medrash tells us that when Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos, so Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos, and at that moment, Klal Yisrael, the Torah, went under a tremendous transformation. In fact, the Chazal tell us that prior to the Shviras HaLuchos, Limud HaTorah would have been much, much simpler, much less tsar involved. No person wouldn't need the Amailus that is required nowadays. And when Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Torah, so then, in fact, what happened was that the Torah changed. And now, for us to understand the Torah, it takes a lot more effort, it takes a lot more work. And the question that I want to delve into today is, why is that the case? Why did the Torah go under this transformation? Why was it necessary? Now, at first glance, you'll tell me, well, Klal Yisrael were not on the same Madrega as they were. And because Klal Yisrael lost or dropped in Madrega, so therefore they were no longer able to understand the Torah the way and the level they understood it before. And now, definitionally, it became a lot more difficult. But it seems like from Chazal that it's not simply that they didn't understand it, or they were no longer on the level where they were able to understand it, because Chazal focus again on the tsar that it takes, almost as if it's an onesh, almost as if it's a punishment. It used to be very easy. You used to remember there was no such thing as shikha. But now, because of the Eigel, so now there's going to be something called shikha. And it's going to be very hard to understand the Torah. And it's going to be very hard to retain the Torah. The Chazal focus on the melus required and the tsar required, not just the lack of understanding, which makes it seem, to me at least, that the tsar involved now was some sort of onesh for the maisa of the Eigel, which of course begs the question, why is this punishment the punishment of the Eigel? Eigel was an Aveira seemingly along the lines of Avodah Zarah. Why did the Rebbeinu Shalom say that the appropriate response is going to be a response of difficulty when it comes to Talmud Torah? Furthermore, the Gemara tells us in Meseches Erevin that, as I mentioned before, the Torah used to be much easier to retain the Torah. There was no such thing as shikha. The Medrash says as follows: Kasav zeh mikra ki api advarim ha'elu zu Mishnah v'Talmud Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbeinu Shalom says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Nitzta'arta, you seem like you are having pain, you are in pain, you are very troubled by what just happened, the Maisa Eigel and the Shviras HaLuchos. Chayecha einata mafsid. I promise you, says the Rebbeinu Shalom, you're not going to lose out. Beluchos rishonos lo hayu elo yud hadibros bilvad. In the Luchos Rishonos, there are only Aseres Hadibros. Achshav shenitztarta ninoisin lecha halachos midrashos agodas v'talmud. Now that you have seen this, this has caused you pain. Now that you have experienced Shviras HaLuchos, you don't only have Aseres Hadibros, you have halachos and midrashos and godos and Talmud. And again, this medrash is very difficult to understand. Of course, the Torah was the same Torah before and after. Now, as we mentioned, just much more difficult. So we need all these midrashim to explain it. And we have all these halachos which are hard for us to retain. But why is this a schar? It's almost as if Rebbeinu Shalom saying, Moshe Rabbeinu, don't worry. It's okay that it lost. You used to just have a seres adibs. Of course there were taryag mitzvahs, but it was much easier to remember. It was much easier to understand. Now I have to know all mishnayos. I have to know shas bav Bavli, Yerushalmi, I have to know Medrash Tanchuma, Medrash Rabbah, I have to know Mechilta, Teres Koyanim. There's so much to know. Why is this supposed to appease Moshe Rabbeinu? This is supposed to make Moshe Rabbeinu happy. Moshe Rabbeinu's bitzar over the Shivrei Luchos. How do we understand what Chazal are trying to tell us? So I think that the key to understanding this transformation, what exactly took place between the Luchos Rishonos and the Luchos Shniyos, is in fact found in a comment of Chazal, which we're all familiar with, but perhaps don't spend enough time focusing on. The Chazal tell us in a Braisa in the last parak of Maseches Avos, Ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisek b'Torah mitzvos. We all know the Chazal. Ein lecha ben chayrin. No one is considered to be truly free. Ela misha oisek b'Torah u b'mitzvos. The problem is, where do Chazal know this from? How do Chazal know? Ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisek b'Torah mitzvos. So you'll tell me from personal experiences. We know a free life is a life of following the Rebbeinu Shalom. But Chazal aren't saying this from themselves. Chazal aren't saying this is our experience. Chazal bring a pasuk. What pasuk do Chazal bring? Chazal bring the pasuk that we have in this week's parsha of the Choros al haluchos. Al tikre Choros ela cheros. Since it says it was chiseled on the luchos, al tikre Choros. Don't read it as chiseled, Choros inscribed. Rather read it as cheros. Ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisek b'Torah u'b'mitzvos. And again, very difficult to understand. Yes, it's a very similar word. Choros means chiseled. It has the same shirish, perhaps. What does it have to do with cheres? Chazal are pointing to a play on words over here. It says choros when it comes to the luchos, and it says cheres in the lashon of cheres of freedom. So it must be ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisek b'Torah mitzvos. What's going on over here? How do we understand the simple understanding of the words of Chazal? And furthermore, what bothers me is, when was this pasuk said with regards to the Luchos Rishonos? The Luchos Shniyos, it doesn't say Choros. In fact, the Gemara in Eruvin says, how do we know that the Luchos Rishonos there was no Shikha, but the Luchos Shniyos there was Shikha, that we do forget Torah? The Gemara in Eruvin says, from this pasuk, the Gemara says, Mai dichsiv Choros ala Luchos, ilmale lo nishtabu Luchos Rishonos lo nishtachu Torah miYisrael. Choros indicates that it's there inscribed forever. There would be no shikha. But a second luchos, it doesn't say choros because there is shikha. So how could Chazal come and say ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisek b'Torah v'mitzvah shenemar choros alochos? Maybe that was for the luchos rishonos. Luchos shniyos, it doesn't say choros. On the contrary, Chazal clearly tell us that it specifically doesn't say choros. Over there, luchos shniyos in the parasha uses the lashon of ksiva, not the lashon of choros. So how are we understanding what Chazal mean to tell us? Ein lecha ben chayrin ela mi she'oisek b'Torah u'b'mitzvos. I think the understanding in Chazal is as follows. How do Chazal glean from the first luchos, choros ala luchos, from that word, choros ala luchos, where do they see anywhere ein lecha ben chayrin ela mi she'oisek b'Torah u'b'mitzvos? What Chazal are telling us is as follows. Take a look at the luchos rishonos. Luchos rishonos were luchos. They seemingly were physical stones. But somehow, luchos rishonos, we know, they were mem v'samach shebeluchos b'neis hayu oimdim, because they were choros, they were chiseled through and through. That means the mem and the samach must be b'neis hayu oimdim. In fact, the whole thing was a nes. The Medrash seems to say that Moshe Rabbeinu, it was too heavy for Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore he really wasn't able to lift them. That's why when the oisios were parches ba'avir, he dropped them. But when the oisios were on the luchos, he was able to. Why? Because even though physically these are two physical stones, the Torah that was imprinted on these stones, the ruchnius that was imprinted on these stones, allowed the physical aspect of these stones to no longer restrict them. What Chazal see from choros ala luchos is that your physical restrictions, your physical limitations could be overcome and overwhelmed by ruchnius. If you infuse yourself with Torah, you're able to overcome and overpower your ruchnius. That's what Chazal saw with the luchos rishonos. Now what happens? The Luchos Rishonos are given to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Klal Yisrael ask for an intermediary. They build an Eigel Hazav. Klal Yisrael, we know, of course, they weren't being kofer in the Rebbeinu Shalom, but as all the Mefarshim explain, they wanted a replacement for Moshe Rabbeinu. They wanted an intermediary. They wanted someone to bridge the gap, so to speak, between them and the Rebbeinu Shalom. What they were saying is, we're physical beings. We can't possibly infuse ourselves directly with Elokus. We can't be in touch with the Rebbeinu Shalom directly. And therefore they built the Eigel. Why an Eigel? Of course, many different pshatim. The Chizkuni says because that was their understanding of what Malachim looked like for whatever reason, because the Erev Rav built it, a fascinating Chizkuni, the Erev Rav built it, and they didn't see the full Gilui at Kriyas Yamsov. They only saw the feet, and the feet of the Malachim looked like an Eigel, so therefore they built an Eigel. Whatever reason, that is why they were building what they viewed as a Malach to be the intermediary, to have that relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom that they wanted, but they couldn't have it directly because they're just merely bas of Adam, they're physical beings. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, I understand what you wanted, I understand that you feel that you couldn't have that direct relationship, but you went about it in the wrong way. I am going to give you a replacement for what you were looking for. And the replacement for what you're looking for is called Talmud Torah. It's called Amailus b'Torah. Now no longer are you going to have the Chorus al Haluchos handed to you, but now in the aftermath of the Eigel, where you want to develop this relationship, you don't need an intermediary. What you need to do is elevate yourselves so that you can have that relationship with me. Now how do you elevate yourselves? You're merely bas of Adam. Comes the Rebbeinu Shalom and says, that is what the role of Amailus b'Torah, working in Torah, overpowering, overwhelming your physical limitations, that will have the ability of rising you above, allowing you to rise above your physical limitations. The Chorus al Haluchos now was transformed. Now it's no longer Chorus al Haluchos, it's Chorus al Libecha. Now no longer are the Luchos oimdim b'neis. Now the Rebbeinu Shalom says, if you want to develop this relationship, I understand that you felt overwhelmed. You felt that you couldn't enjoy this relationship with me because you're merely bas v'dam. Let me give you an ability to overpower and overwhelm your limitations of being a bas v'dam. And therefore the Rebbeinu Shalom changed the entirety of the nature of Torah. It's no longer an easy process where Chorus al Haluchos is handed to us. Now our process is a process of toil, of sweat, of effort, of forgetting, where the words become Chorus al Libecha, where we elevate ourselves and are able to have that relationship directly with the Rebbeinu Shalom, the one that we wanted before. Ein lecha ben chayrin ela amisha oisik b'Torah shenemar v'chorus al libecha. Just like the Luchos HaRishonos were able to overpower their physical limitations when they were infused with Torah, in the Luchos Shniyas you didn't have chorus when it comes to the Luchos Shniyas. But instead of chorus in the Luchos, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, you are going to be the ones. Libecha, it's going to be chorus al libecha. You're going to be the ones where the Torah is inscribed on your heart. And through that process, just like the Luchos were able to overcome their physical limitations through the Ruchnius, through the Torah, you, through your Limud Torah, through your Amailus b'Torah, through your Pas V'Melech Toichel Yila Oretz Tishan, you will be able to overcome your physical limitations. You could have a person like a Vilna Gaon who's a Malach Hashem Tzivakos. A person who barely eats, who barely sleeps, how is it possible? Ein lecha ben chayrin el misha oisik b'Torah mitzvahs. When you're oisik b'Torah, you infuse yourself with spirituality. Just like those luchos were no longer restricted by their physical properties, a human being now, through his Amailus b'Torah, is able to overcome his physical restrictions, just like those stones of the Luchos Rishonos. The transformation between Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Shniyos is where is the Choros. In Luchos Rishonos, the Choros was on the Luchos. But then we said that no, we can't connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Rebbeinu Shalom says you want to connect directly, it's going to be through overcoming your physical restrictions. Now it's no longer Choros ala Luchos, now it's Choros ala Becha. You could free yourselves from your physical temptations, your physical desires, your physical restrictions. Just like those two stones were able to be free when Torah was infused, now you could free yourself from those physical restrictions which define you as a basar v'dam. This was the main transformation that took place. It wasn't an oynesh for Klal Yisrael, that Torah would now be hard. It was in fact the answer to their tefillos. They wanted this relationship. They wanted the relationship to be able to connect to the Rebbeinu Shalom, but they weren't able to attain it. They thought they needed an intermediary because they're merely basav adam. The Rebbeinu Shalom says you don't need an intermediary. What you need is to be able to rise above your physical limitations. Now I'm taking away the luchos, that's choros al luchos. I'm not handing you anything that's overwhelming physicality. Now you're going to have to work for it. But through the effort, through the choros al ibecha, you will become chayrin, you will become free from your physical limitations. And as you become free, you will enjoy the relationship that you so desired. Not through an intermediary, but directly with the Rebbeinu Shalom. The aspect of Talmud Torah, which makes it so difficult that we forget, and that it's hard to understand, and that we have to review, that aspect of Talmud Torah is our greatest gift, because that's what allows us to overpower our physical temptations and enjoy a direct relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom without the need for any intermediaries.